Good morning. All right, we are in class number 28. We are into our final 5 class periods. So today and 4 more we have. Our last class will be on Sunday, January the 2nd here. So today we are going to finish up the actual Judges. We've been out of the book of Judges now for a little over a month as we wrapped up that actual book. But as we noted, the story of Ruth actually occurs in the time period of Judges, and the first several chapters of 1 Samuel also occur during that time period of the Judges here. And so the actual details of the final 2 Judges, at least some of the details, we have recorded here in 1 Samuel. So we're going to be talking about that. So we did mention that on Wednesday, just looking at the rest of the schedule here. And I'm on the books to teach out here for the rest of the time, just because when I put together the schedule for the class, the intro and the end weren't as clear to just tell people these are the scriptures you're going to cover. So I kind of took that on myself to do those. So we are going to continue this idea of what happens after Joshua, Judges, and Ruth, and we're going to run out the rest of the Old Testament over the next 4 classes, and then that final class will have kind of a review overall summary here. But also I will say the same thing today that I said last Sunday. If there is a topic or anything that we've covered that you have a question about, please make sure to let me know. We've definitely got time in here. If you've been in some of my classes before, I'm very able to compress history quickly, so I can combine several of these classes into one if needed, if there are some special topics that we need to look at. So primarily we are going to be in the book of 1 Samuel today, but before we get into this, let's just remember a few things about the period here. So right now, where is God worshiped? Where is the primary location for worship of Jehovah at this time period? I'm sorry? Okay, it's in Shiloh. In what building? Or not even really a building, right? Yeah, in the Tabernacle. That's right, okay? There is still no temple yet. This is the same tent that was built and used during the Exodus from Egypt period here, okay? Now, of course, it's not the exact same tent. It's been 400 years, so I'm sure there have been pieces replaced and the upkeep kept. We know for a time that the tabernacle, just like all of their clothes, didn't decompose, nothing happened to it. It stayed in pretty much pristine condition. When we talk about the tabernacle, then it really is still the same pattern as the temple's going to be. So we have the outer court here, made up of that big tent wall that sits on the outside there with a gate. I don't have the gate drawn up here, but at the far right there is where the entrance to that would be. And then we have the actual tabernacle itself, which is that interior square, which just like the temple is going to be made up of 2 sections, the holy place and the holy of holies, or the most holy place, which is divided by what? That dashed line there. The veil, that's right, okay? And then in the outer court, we have several elements here. There's the huge altar of burnt offerings with those great big horns on each corner. There is, between that and the actual tabernacle itself, there is the laver, which is a big basin of water, which they're doing some ritual cleaning there. And then inside the actual tabernacle itself, there's only one piece of furniture that's located inside the Holy of Holies, and that is what? Yeah, the Ark of the Covenant, and that will become important in today's story here. And then in the holy place, we have 3 pieces of furniture. There's a small table to the right side as soon as you enter there, the showbread table here. There's another table on the other side, which is, it's not a table, it's a big lampstand. And then there is, of course, right before you would go in, there is that altar of incense that it exists right at the veil where the incense can go through the veil into the most holy of holies, okay? As we already said, the tabernacle is located in Shiloh. We still find that in 1 Samuel chapter 1 and verse 3. It's been here since it was moved there in Joshua's time. So after the conquest was over, you may remember when they first crossed into the land, they kind of made a somewhat permanent camp there at Gilgal, and that's where the tabernacle resided. And then at the end of the conquest, when Joshua says, hey, I've beaten all the armies, they moved it up to Shiloh in Joshua chapter 18 and verse 1. And so just to kind of give you that general idea, it is located, Shiloh is within Ephraim, right there pretty much in the center of the land, which makes sense, of course, because what are they still supposed to do every year? Yeah, they're still supposed to gather for those feasts, right? So it makes sense for it to be centrally located there, okay? So for approximately 350 years, somewhere between 350 and 400 years, it's been sitting here in Shiloh. So at this time, there is a more permanent location. It is true that the tabernacle is still a tent. However, by this time, there's a whole bunch of buildings around it. An entire town has grown up around the tabernacle. So even though it's supposed to be a tent that can move, it hasn't moved for 350 plus years. So then we are introduced to the second to last judge here in 1 Samuel, a guy named Eli. He was a priest. We find in chapter 1 and verse 9, we're not told, but the way that he acts sometimes here, it is entirely possible. Some people have put forward that he was the high priest. I tend to think that they didn't really have a valid high priest at this time myself. But he's called a judge in chapter 4 and verse 18. Now, this may be more along the lines of the traditional judge that was set up in the book of Exodus and the book of Deuteronomy, as opposed to a judge like we see in the book of the Judges, who were primarily military leaders. And the thing that we know the most about Eli is that he has two boys, and their names are, remember? Hophni and Phinehas. Very good. That's right. Okay. And what do we know about them? Were they good guys or bad guys? Bad guys, okay, really bad guys. Chapter 2, verse 12, depending on what version you read, they're called all kinds of names here. Corrupt, worthless men, wicked men, sons of Belial, base men, sons of worthlessness. None of the translations talk very well about them, how that phrase is translated there. And they do a few things that are really, really bad here, okay? Because Eli is the priest and because his sons are put into a leadership position, they really corrupt some of the things that are supposed to happen there in the tabernacle. First thing it says they do is they take way more of the sacrifice than they were allotted as priests. Are they supposed to take some of the sacrifice? Yes. But they take almost all of it, okay? They take way more than they are supposed to. And not only do they take more than they're supposed to, they take the best portions that were specifically called out to be set aside for God, right? The absolute best portions were supposed to be set aside and made as part of the offering, but they take those first before the offerings are burnt there. And then it says, perhaps the worst thing here it says they lay with the women who assembled at the door of the tabernacle of meeting. This may be just a statement of their abuse of their power. It may also be kind of a statement of where Israel is at in their overall morality, because we notice that in the time period of Judges, what's really happening to their overall morality? Right, spiraling down here, okay? The women were, what's that? Yeah, that's right, okay? I have no idea what you said, so I just said that's right. Women were there to serve. Exodus chapter 38 and verse 8, they were appointed to be in the temple, and it was part of they were supposed to be there, but probably, and I believe that this is definitely true as we see, and we've talked about several times, how that when the children of Israel moved into the land, they were supposed to bring Judaism to the Canaanites. But in reality, what happened? Yeah, the Canaanites influenced them. Exactly right, okay? So I believe that this is probably more of an overall corruption to match the Canaanite practices. Remember, ritual prostitution at the temples is something that was part of Canaanite worship, okay? So this is why they are there. And the reason this would be called out as something that they are doing they're not supposed to be doing is this is actually a practice that God knew that the Canaanites were doing, and he knew that the Israelites were going to be tempted to take up. And so he told them very specifically, do not do this, both in the book of Exodus and the book of Deuteronomy, and the book of Leviticus. Actually, in 3 places, it specifically says, don't do that. So Eli decides that he's going to confront his sons about the situation here. What he does do, he does some very good things, okay? He condemns their actions. He makes a very big point and brings up to them that, hey, your sin is widely known, okay? And not only is it a sin against him as their father, but more importantly, it's a sin directly against God. So he really makes this great speech to them. However, Eli is all what? He's all talk, okay? He doesn't actually do anything, okay? He doesn't do more than talk. He does not submit them to discipline under the law, which should have been stoning. Now, I get that. Would it be hard to submit your own sons for stoning? I can't imagine doing that, okay? But it's what he's supposed to do. He does not act as a judge of the people, and he does not act as a priest. He just kind of runs his mouth and yells at them, and then goes back in the house, and they continue doing all of these terrible things. So because of that, there is a prophecy made by a man of God against Eli's family here. Why do you kick at my sacrifice? Again, different versions translate that differently. Really, the phrase here is kick dust at. So it's that just a sign of disrespect. You're kicking dust at them. And more specifically, God says, you flat out honor your sons more than me. And even though they are doing this terrible thing with the offering, they're doing it, you know about it, and you're still eating those best offerings. And you're still making yourself fat over these best offerings here. So this prophecy is made that the family is going to get cut off. God is going to eventually do some great things for Israel, but Eli's family is going to see none of that. They're not going to get any of the benefits. In fact, they are all going to have violent deaths. None of his family will ever grow to old age, it says. They will all die violent deaths in their youth. They will be cursed to continual poverty. Oh, and by the way, both of your absolutely terrible sons, they're going to die on the same day is the prophecy that's made here. Now, while all of this is being set up about the current environment and about the current judge, Eli, and what's going on, we also have sprinkled into these first several chapters this beautiful story of the next judge who's coming, and his name is Samuel. So what do we know about Samuel here? His father, anybody remember his father's name? Elkanah was his father's name, okay? He was an Ephraimite, of course, right there close to Shiloh. Samuel's mother, which is a bit more famous, everybody knows that? Hannah, that's right, okay? She was not the only wife of Elkanah, but she was the favorite wife. We find out that she was barren, and repeatedly she is ridiculed by one of the other wives, Peninnah, okay? So they decide then that they are going to go up to Shiloh. How often did the family go to Shiloh? Every year, just like they're supposed to. That's right, okay? So this is already, we're seeing that despite the terrible corruption of the worship of Jehovah that is taking place in Israel, Elkanah and his family are being true to the word of God, and they are doing what they are supposed to do. So they go up there to worship and to make the sacrifice, and it specifically calls out that because she is the favorite wife, Elkanah makes sure that she receives a double portion to make a special offering there. And her special offering is all going to have to do around this idea of her being so upset. And what is she so upset about? No baby, that's right. And to make it worse, she's continually provoked by Peninnah here, poked at, I've got sons, you don't. I don't understand why that's such a big deal, but apparently, and Elkanah even is kind of a little bit offended as her husband, and he makes a statement to her, am I not more to you than 10 sons? But apparently not. So she puts him in his place kind of real quickly there. So, of course then, Eli, who is still the priest here, she sees Hannah after the meal. So they've had the meal, they're there at the tabernacle, and what does he think when he first sees her? Anybody remember the story? Yeah, she's drunk. Because what's she doing? Yeah, she's praying, but she's moving her lips, right? And no sound is coming out here, okay? So she's really praying in earnest, and he thinks she's drunk. I think that says a couple things. One, this is not common behavior, as it should be. And Eli, as a priest, is completely off his rocker, because somebody in the temple, what should they be doing? Praying, okay? But his first assumption is, no, somebody who wandered in here who's drunk and doesn't know what to do. Okay, so of course, she's making this incredible prayer, give me a son, and I will give him to you. Okay, which, again, seems strange, right? The thing that she wants more than anything else is to have a son, and she promises God, well, if you give me a son, I'll just give him away. I'll give him right back to you, okay? So Eli then blesses Hannah and says, this is all going to work out for you. So Samuel is going to have to be a Nazirite, the same as with Samson. One of the other judges was a Nazirite here. And we already looked at what this means in Numbers chapter 6. Can't have anything to drink produced or eat produced from the grapevine. No razor can ever come to his head. Never come near a dead body. Even if it's your own family, you can't go to that funeral. You can't be close to the dead body there. And of course, it calls for the end of a Nazirite period. You could be a Nazirite for a month. You could be a Nazirite for a year. However, Samuel is going to be a Nazirite for how long? His whole life. That's right. He is dedicated. His mother makes that decision. His whole life, he's going to have to abide by these rules of a Nazirite here. So Samuel is born. After returning home, God remembers Hannah, and she conceives and bears a son. And names him Samuel, which anybody remember what Samuel means? Pretty famous. I was heard by God is what Samuel means, okay? Which also has another connotation for his name as he would move forward here. And so now everybody else goes to make this yearly trip back up there, but Hannah stays home. She does not go back to the temple until she has weaned Samuel. So now when she had weaned him, we don't know exactly how long that is. At least 3 years old, all scholars will say would be what the Jewish period of weaning would have been called. We sometimes think of that as probably at that 1.5 year mark, to 2 year mark when, in today's world, children either quit breastfeeding or get off the bottle and start being able to eat solid food. However, they weren't considered weaned just because of that in Israelite history. In fact, it may be that it wasn't until he was as old as 5 that he would have been considered weaned and ready for her to dedicate him to service. So Samuel is brought to Eli here, chapter 1, verses 26 to 28. And he is left completely in Eli's care in chapter 2. And then, of course, the whole first part of chapter 2 is Hannah's very beautiful prayer. We're not going to take the time to read that this morning. But there's just beautiful prayer of thanks to God for the son that she was given here. So as a result of all of this, Samuel is now staying at the temple with Eli, and almost immediately he begins to minister before the Lord. Now, as you would expect, somebody who was dedicated to the temple would have been serving in the house of the Lord, but most likely as a young kid just, cleaning up and doing dishes and I don't know what else, kind of little menial tasks he probably would have been given. But God specifically goes out of his way to point out that even as a child, he is already ministering to the Lord, serving as a priest almost here, as he would be considered because he's working there in the temple. Now, every year, Hannah's going to continue to come see him, and every year she brings him a robe, kind of his birthday present there. And then, as a result of this, Elkanah and Hannah were rewarded. As is often the case, God sees beyond Samuel here. They have 3 more sons and 2 more daughters. And Samuel grows here in chapter 2, verses 21 and 26, extremely similar to the language that's used in the New Testament about Jesus growing in knowledge and in wisdom and in favor with men here. So very similar passage. And when he is still very young here, Samuel's going to make his first prophecy. Even though the word of the Lord was rare in those days and there was no widespread revelation, we find that in chapter 3 and verse 1, still Samuel is going to make some of his prophecies here. Eli is starting to get pretty old, he's starting to go blind, and Samuel is ministering to the Lord before Eli. Probably means very similar to we saw Joshua being the main servant of Moses. So anytime it says Moses went somewhere in the book of Exodus, pretty much every time who was with him? Joshua. Same thing here, right? Samuel is the dedicated servant, the one who is always with Eli. So even when Eli goes into these places to do the priestly worship, Samuel is going with him there and probably performing most of the deeds. And then, of course, we have the great thing that everybody knows about Samuel. He's laying down at night, and what does he hear? Yeah, he hears someone calling his name, right? Samuel, okay? Now, of course, who does he think it is? What's that? No. Eli. Yeah, he thinks it's Eli. That's right, okay? So he thinks it's Eli. In fact, goes running to him and says, hey, what do you want? Well, it's not Eli. And Eli finally figures it out. Who was it really? It was God. That's right, Jehovah, okay? And why didn't Samuel recognize God's voice? Chapter 3 and verse 7. Yeah, he had never heard the Lord speak before, okay? Now, what does that mean is going to happen? From this point on, guess what God is saying here? Samuel's going to hear the voice of the Lord a lot, okay? And Samuel becomes perhaps one of the greatest prophets, definitely one of the guys who in the entire Old Testament speaks for the Lord the longest period of time. He is perhaps the most influential person who is not a king in the history of Israel here, okay? So, of course, how many times does Samuel think it's Eli? If you're in the Bible and you're going to guess a number, what's the first number you're going to guess? Probably 3, that's right, okay? 40 is too much, 12 maybe, but 3 makes sense, so we'll guess that. 3, 12, and 40 are the numbers you're going to always guess anyway. But Eli recognizing it's God calling to Samuel, and of course tells him to go lay down and answer, speak, Lord, for your servant is here if you call. And of course, very famous, what does Samuel end up saying? Here I am, right? Very famous call here, okay? So, what does the Lord tell Samuel? Well, of course, there's this great prophecy against Eli and his family. Now, we already talked about what that prophecy entailed. Does Samuel run to tell Eli the news? No, I wouldn't either, right? Here's this still relatively young kid, gets this terrible prophecy against his boss and the guy who's raising him, Eli. So he kind of waits till morning and he waits till Eli calls to ask him about it. Of course, why was he hesitant to share this prophecy with Eli? Probably afraid. This was a terrible vision against Eli here. Of course, we tend to think that Eli probably had a clue in verse 17, and then of course in his response in verse 18, hey, what's going to happen is going to happen. It's not from you, it's from the Lord here, okay? So then we again find this in chapter 3, verse 19. And Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him, and let none of his words fall to the ground. Okay? That's the ESV version there, the actual literal translation of that. Let none of his words fall to the ground. What does that mean? What's that? Okay, actually, it doesn't mean that. It's not God's words to Samuel, it's Samuel's words that he's speaking. What's that? That's right, okay? So, depending on your translation, it may say, and let none of his words fail, New American Standard Bible, or if you have the Holman Christian Standard, it says, and let nothing he said prove false. Okay, that's really what it's meaning. Everything that he says is held up. It's held up to be true. None of it falls to the ground. None of it falls flat. None of it falls here, okay? And so we look at some of these next verses there, that Samuel was established as the prophet of the Lord. Then the Lord appeared to him again in Shiloh, for the Lord revealed himself to Samuel in Shiloh by the word of the Lord. So just as we kind of presumed from that verse he didn't yet know the voice of the Lord, Samuel is going to become the primary prophet here. And it's going to last for a good long time. So word spreads. Chapter 3, verse 20, all Israel from Dan to Beersheba, so far north to the far south again, they know. Chapter 4, verse 1, and the word of Samuel came to all of Israel. So he is very quickly becoming the central figure in Israel, at least as far as understanding what is going to happen and what God's will is. So even though we are out of the book of Judges, we are still following this cycle of the book of the Judges that we have been talking about this whole time. So there's going to be this rise of an oppressor. Who is the oppressor this time? Philistines, that's right, okay? So the Philistines decide to rebel against Israel. Technically, they were subject to Israel, but not in much reality here, okay? And so the first battle comes up, and they win this first battle easily. And Israel army has to hightail it back, and what in the world happens here? So Israel decides we're going to get an even larger army, and we're going to fight back. So they gather more men, but what don't they do? Even though there is now this great prophet in the land, they still don't do what? Yeah, they don't ask God, what should we do here, okay? So instead, they come up with their own plan here, and they think, you know what? The entire time that we were leaving Egypt, our fathers were leaving Egypt, and then during the conquest, what was moving around? Even though it wasn't always moving around, but still, the ark. Surely, if we take the ark out, God won't let the ark be taken. So they call for the ark to be brought, and of course, in a sign that things are going to go wrong, the two bad guys, Eli's sons, they go into the most holy of holies, and they, I guess that's not right, the most holy of holies, the most holy or the holy of holies. They go in there, and they get the ark, and they take it from Shiloh to the camp at Ebenezer here. Now, what's the Philistine response? The ark comes into the camp, and everybody in the camp goes nuts. They're super excited. They're screaming, all right, we're going to win this battle for sure. The Israelites are scared because what do they remember? Even now, 350 years later, the people in the land still remember what happened where? In Egypt, right? They still remember all that terrible things that God did to Egypt to get the people to go. So they're freaking out. Their God is with them. They remember everything that happened in Egypt. But someone among them stands up and says, hey, are we going to take this? Are we going to become their servants like they are our servants now? And so they decide they're going to fight anyway. And Israel, completely unexpected, they lose terribly. Over 30,000 men are killed in the battle. And most importantly, what is captured? Yeah, they capture the ark, okay? Now, of course, of those people who are killed, unsurprisingly, because God said it was going to happen, who are two of the 30,000? Yeah, that's right. Hophni and Phinehas here. Okay, so the death of Eli's sons. Somebody runs back to tell Eli, and of course, Eli very famously falls off his chair, breaks his neck, and dies, okay? So we have the death of Eli here. Now, we take about a chapter and a half to have this quick little side story about the ark. Anybody remember this side story? It's pretty cool. We talk about it in a lot of kids' classes here. So the Philistines captured the ark, and they're thinking, all right, we've got this ark, we've got their great treasure, but was it a good thing for the Philistines that they had the ark? No, it's terrible, right? Okay, it doesn't go well for them at all. They move it into their primary temple of Dagon, and what ends up happening to the statue of Dagon? Anybody remember? Yeah, the first day, it just falls and bows down. And so they think, well, maybe something happened and it fell over. So they set it back up, and the next day, what happens? It's fallen down, and its hands and head are cut off, okay? So no way this is going to be a coincidence, this, okay? Of course, then all the people around there, huge numbers of them just outright die, and those who don't die start to develop these terrible tumors. And we also find later that, even though it doesn't say it here, that apparently there was a terrible just infestation of mice come in and take over everything. All this terrible stuff happens to them. So they think, if bad stuff happened when we brought this here, what should we do? We should make it go away. So they don't send it back first. They try to move it around to all these different cities within the Philistine Empire. And of course, every time they move the ark, what happens? Those problems follow. Everywhere it goes, people die and people get these tumors. So now they decide, hey, this was a big mistake. We need to send it back. So for a total of 7 months, we're told, the Philistines had the ark and all these terrible things were happening. And they bring in some of their priests and some of their soothsayers to say, hey, what do we got to do? And they say, send it back. And don't just send it back empty. Send it back with this incredible guilt offering. Make tumors and mice of gold and send them there so that maybe the tumors and the mice will go with it as this offering here. And they're still not even sure, despite all of this is happening, maybe this was just a coincidence. So anybody remember the plan by which they're going to figure out if God did it or if it was just a coincidence? They load up this cart, right? And they put an ox in front of the cart and they just kind of let it go. And they say, if the oxen takes the cart back to Israel, then what do we know? Well, God has been causing all this. But if it goes a different way, well, it was just all a coincidence, okay? But of course we know what happens. It goes right back to Israel and the ark is returned, okay? And it stays at the house of this guy called Abinadab here. Okay, so now we see that even though we have left the book of Judges, that the cycle of the Judges continues. That people had sinned. We're not specifically told this time, but we pretty much assume, like always, it was the sin of idolatry. God sends an oppressor, who we know are the Philistines. Israel cries out. In chapter 7 and verse 2, it says, and they lamented to the Lord. So they cry out and they ask for help here. And so God is going to raise a judge, but the judge is kind of already in place. Who is it? Samuel, that's right. Okay, so he's already there as this great prophet, but now he is going to also become this great leader for the entire people here, okay? So what does Samuel tell the people to do? First and foremost, if you want God to rescue you, you better do what? Repent, right? So return to the Lord with all of your hearts. And the whole reason you're in this problem is you can't get rid of these other gods. So of course we got to put away all these foreign gods, got to make them go away, and prepare your hearts for the Lord so that whatever is going to happen, whatever God wants to happen, you be ready for that. And we have to serve him only. The basic 4 tenets that he lays out here. And if you do this, then God will deliver you. Now, of course, what are the 2 primary gods that are mentioned here that are just the bane of Israel's existence for not only these 350 years, but all the way down until we get to the New Testament. That's right, the Baal and Ashtaroth, or Asherah, okay? So Baal was the male god of Canaan. He supposedly was over fertility, war. We see him always presented as the bull god, and constantly, there are these problems for Israel. In fact, so much so that all of these images have been found in Israelite homes that have been excavated over the years. So there's an image there. Actually, that was in copper stamped image. And then, of course, a little bit earlier bronze figurine, all the way back to some clay idols that were found in some homes. And then, of course, this is kind of a drawing that was found in a relief on a pot in one place, okay? So who was the Ashtoreth or the Asherah? It was Baal's counterpart, the female goddess, sometimes called Astarte. Oftentimes you will see it simply called the groves in the Old Testament here, where they grew the groves or they worshiped at the groves, or they're told to go cut down the groves. Excuse me. Instead of inside of a temple, the worship of the goddess Ashtoreth will always happen outside here. She is sometimes called the Queen of Heaven, the wife or the consort of Baal, and most predominantly women would worship her. So here's some drawings. She is represented in many different ways. Here's a little fountain that was found of her. And then another relief here, again with just the animals out in the wilderness, and all the way back to some really, really ancient small little carvings that have been found of her. So constantly plaguing Israel here, and Samuel is saying, we got to get this out. We can't keep doing this if we want God to rescue us, okay? So of course, Samuel now is going to judge Israel, it says. So Israel follows Samuel's advice, chapter 7 and verse 4. Samuel has them gather at Mizpah. And this map here shows some of the major movements of the armies here. And so they're going to gather up at Mizpah, right here in the center of the land. Okay, just a little bit to the west there of Shiloh. The Philistines, just as that graph there shows that big arrow coming up here. So the Philistines are going to come up and they attack them there at Mizpah, okay? And God then is going to save them. Just like before, God is going to use weather to save them. He doesn't throw hailstones or anything this time. Anybody remember what it says? Thunder, that's right, okay? So some terrible kind of thunder. I can only imagine probably like some of the thunder we had in the past week around here that was pretty crazy, shaking their houses, actually shaking the foundations of the earth, so much so that it says, the NIV I think probably puts it best, it just threw them into a panic. So even though their army is bigger, their army just goes crazy with all this thunder going on around them. And so Israel is able to rout them, and Israel actually pursues them down to Beth Kar. So it comes right down into this area, which is right close to a city called Gath. So they go from there in Mizpah all the way down the mountain into that area of Philistia. Okay? So it says here that just like we would expect from any cycle of the judges, we're going to have a very successful campaign against that oppressor here. So the Philistines are subdued. And it says all of the cities taken were restored. Okay, and it says specifically from Ekron to Gath. So if we looked at a little bit of a zoom up of that map here, and you can see that all of those cities, I don't have my pointer, but that blue line is now where the Philistines are being compressed back into, and then all of those cities just outside that blue line are retaken. And some of these you may recognize, especially Ekron and Gath, are going to become very important in the life of who? And even before him, Saul, right? They're going to become major battle points for Saul, and then they do become very important cities also in the life of David here, okay? So now that all of those cities have been taken, also Samuel is able to negotiate, or because now they have a strong army, perhaps the Amorites just back off. So if you think about Philistia then being over on the west side, which if I do this, it's going to be east for you. So over on the west side, the Amorites are where? On the east side, that's right. So now, instead of being attacked from the outside from both of these lands like they have been for the past 300 years, Samuel actually starts to get this peace, okay? So he has peace on both sides now of Israel. And it says that Samuel judges Israel for all of his life. Even though Samuel is going to be alive all the way through, this kind of preview of what's coming, right? He's going to be alive through both of the first two kings of the United Kingdom here, okay? But he is going to remain a judge for all of his life. And it says that he makes a circuit, every year making a circuit going among the cities. But did you really look at a map? When you think, if he's judging all of Israel and he makes a circuit, where would you think he might travel? Yeah, Dan to Beersheba. But nope. Instead, he just makes this tiny little circuit all around Shiloh. So he just continues to make this circuit every year and visit some of these major cities and expects that if people are going to, if there's problems, if they need to have his judgment, they are going to come to him at one of those cities. So he truly does not unite the land from north to south, but just instead really kind of unites that central territory, taking care of the Philistines on one side and the Amorites on the other side, okay? All right, and that takes us up through what we're going to talk about on Wednesday, which will be enough of the period of Judges, and we're going to start transitioning into the monarchy. Now, I hope that as we went through this, I didn't put some slides together on this. I wasn't sure if we would have time to get to it. But there's a really interesting study if you look at Eli and Samuel as the last two judges and what God had expected of his people during this time period of judges as opposed to what really happened. So we already talked about that in the period of judges, the judges were not always really good people, and it always seemed that even after they were released from oppression, it would say the land would have rest for so many years, 20 years or 40 years, and then another generation would come up who didn't remember, and they would go away. So if you think about Eli probably started out as a good guy, but yet what did he fail to do? Yeah, he failed to pass on that faith, that obedience to his children. So now if things were going to fall to his children, things are going to be a mess, okay? And so, of course, that is going to cause all these kinds of problems. And that's really what happens is that next generation doesn't remember, so the Philistines have to come in and Samuel has to save them. However, think about Samuel. Samuel really exemplifies what God had expected from Israel as a nation overall. From the time that Samuel is born, think about that, from the time that Israel moves into the land, Samuel is consecrated wholly to the Lord. What did God tell the children of Israel to do? You go into the land, you get rid of these people, and you only worship who? Me. You only worship Jehovah. That's right. Don't follow after these other gods because they're going to cause you all these problems. That's exactly what happens under Eli. Samuel, however, does express that whole commitment, fully committed to God, and now God is going to be with him just as God was with the people of Israel when they obeyed, but when they went away after other gods, he abandoned them and actually caused that to come in. Which is really going to be interesting when we start talking about this idea that the children of Israel are no longer going to be happy with this judge period. They're no longer going to be happy with Samuel as someone leading them because they want a more physical representation as opposed to a spiritual representation, which is what God wanted. All right? So we'll stop there and we will pick that up on Wednesday.